Hi, everyone. Welcome to the September 7th JupyterLab weekly call. Today we have 14 people on the call. That's a bit light. And we have what appears to be a sparse agenda as well. So why don't we get started? We have at the top of the agenda, Frederic has a bunch of things that he wants to announce, but I don't believe he's on the call. Let's see. The first point is that JupyterLab 3.4.6 and Alpha 28 were published. And then there is some feedback on EuroSci-Fi 2022, where he worked on a poster session for lab and notebook, which you might be curious about. It's linked there. And also JupyterLite and other talks that he's got some information on there that you might want to follow. Apparently, the CZI grant application for the Notebook 7 transition was not accepted. Oh man, the page just moved out from under me. Thanks whoever did that. And oh yeah, and then there is an issue open for PRs that should go into JupyterLab 3.5. So if you have any insight into that, please weigh in. I would answer your questions on this, but I'm not Fred, so I won't.
Quick interjection on the what is it, 3.4.6 release? Yeah, 3.4.6. That does include the Python icon fix that we discussed last week that was requested by the trademark committee.
Cool, thank you. That's good to know. That Lumino, sorry, that 4.0.0 Alpha 28 was the basis of trying to update Jupyter Notebook, but I think I'll talk about that when I talk about Lumino too. Yeah, any other questions or comments, or should we move on? Okay, Gabriel and Kulsum.
It might just be me. So at Quantsite, we have an intern from July 21st to October 21st named Kulsum, who's going to be working on some JupyterLab accessibility issues. And something that we were recently taking a look at was the cell toolbar. And specifically when the user interface is like zoomed up really high. And anyway, we did some looking through GitHub, maybe not as extensively as we could, but we thought it might just be good use of this time since Jason is on the call, if he could maybe just quickly explain, there's just a section of CSS that we're not entirely sure why it's set up the way it is. And I don't know if that if we could do that.
So based on the fact that it's a cell toolbar, I assume you mean me, not Mr. Grout. Oh, and also you tagged me by name. Yeah, reading is hard. Sorry about that. I'll tell you what, let me take a look at this because I didn't realize you were tagging me. 9 times out of 10, it's Mr. Grout who is being referred to. So I will, should I just respond in the context here, or is there an email address I can contact you about?
Yeah, yeah, we were thinking about doing this one of two ways, either just like in real time on the call, or if we could maybe get from you like the best way to get in touch about the code, because I'm not really quite sure. Yeah, what's your preferred method of contact?
On a group this big, on a call this recorded, I don't know if that's the best forum for this. So I can kind of walk through it and give a basic summary of it and context in here. And I'll include my email address if you want to like drop me a line about it.
Okay.
I don't mind that being published either.
Thank you.
We can make the call less recorded and then you could do it.
Sure. Yeah. I know you do that every week.
All right, cool. Thank you. Before I talk about the things that I added to the agenda, I will exhort you again. If there's something you'd like to talk about, please add it to the agenda. But I have 3 unrelated things to talk about. One is that I followed Zach Saylor's lead and made a repo that is private in the JupyterLab org called JupyterLab/council. And I turned on the discussions feature. So the next time a vote arises, why don't we try using this discussions feature and see if it's good? If we don't like it, that's fine. But it seems like low-hanging fruit because I think everyone on the council has a GitHub account. Everyone's already on the team, the relevant team. I wonder if there's actually some auditing of the access to the GitHub org that we should do, and whether it reflects what the actual permissioning structure of the different repos ought to be. I don't know for sure, but I acted as though the JupyterLab Council team is the entity that ought to have permission to this repo, and I didn't find a good way of figuring out if I made a mistake with that, but we can also discover that too. I didn't put a license on that repo because I expected to have no code in it. And if it did have stuff in it, presumably we actually wouldn't want it to be liberally licensed and trivial to fork. We actually would want it to remain private, presumably, but rest assured there's no content in there. Yeah, so that was that. I also, to the Team Compass, there's a link here, I pinned an issue for hosting this call, and I put in all of the dates for this call, basically every Wednesday until the end of the year. If you would like to, please put your name in there. And if you have any questions about the mechanics of it, I'm happy to talk through it with you. Several other people have hosted these calls. We've had Fred and Isabella and Alex, Tim George, Steve, Jason, I believe you've hosted some. So yeah, if you have any questions about the mechanics of it or anything else, or if you have an inclination to do it, please add your name to that list. I am happy to be the host of Last Resort. Like if there's no name there, I'll do it. That's fine. But it's more that I think maybe other people would like to. And also, you know, sometimes you have to do stuff on Wednesdays. So that's that issue. Any questions or comments before I move on to the next thing? Okay. So my third bullet point is about the Lumino 2 migration. And there was a large pull request open to migrate JupyterLab 4's code base to Lumino 2, and that's been merged. It touched a lot of files and probably caused every open PR to require a rebase. I also had to rebase it a lot of times, so I did endure some of the pain I'm inflicting on others, but it's definitely disproportionate because lots of things are going to have to change. But if you look at it, it's primarily to do with using native iterators, which frankly, not that many people were relying on the Lumino things unless they were following the pattern from a superclass that was already exposing an iterator. Like, for example, in the Jupyter notebook for shell, the shell lets you iterate through its widgets, that kind of thing. And also, if you were using the old P styles, P-mod- disabled or stuff like that. And then we used that as the basis of the Alpha 28, which Fred linked above. And then with both of those published, we're trying to port Notebook 7 to use Lumino 2 in this version of lab. But there was a bug in Lumino 2, which meant we had to go back, re-release Lumino 2, which we did yesterday. And there's an open PR that I linked for bumping that version in JupyterLab. So if anyone has the time and inclination, please merge that and or publish a release. And those two things being out will mean that Notebook 7's code base can be migrated over to use Lumino 2. Notebook 7's transition was actually really fairly trivial. It's just almost all package.json stuff. There's a few uses of toArray, which is deprecated but still exists. And there was one place where it exported an iiterator, that shell, that widgets thing that I mentioned earlier. So it's actually given me some solace that extension authors aren't going to really be too inconvenienced by this, because all of Notebook was just a few hundred lines. And almost all that was package.json updates. Okay, there ends all of my updates. Any questions or comments before I move on?
For extension authors, do you then think it's likely that they can have an or dependency? So you can say Lumino 1 or 2, so that you can have the same extension work with both JupyterLab 3 and 4?
Possible, but there are some functions that are just outright gone. So, but they're not functions that many people use, like the iter function. Right now that we use native iterators, we don't have the iter function.
Right. This is assuming that they don't use any of the things that have been removed, right?
Yeah.
Is there like any of the compile steps or extension pre-compilation or whatever that would prevent this from working? I don't remember how the magic works anymore.
When you compile extension, it fixes the version of Lumino and the internal Jupyter packages. So I think you should be okay. It'll substitute in the actual core JupyterLab versions for those. So I think you should be okay if you put either shims in or don't use parts that have changed between the two versions.
That's my intuition too, but I haven't seen it, so I don't have confidence. We changed Lumino's compilation target from ES6 to ES 2018. It's a big change, but the code is so much simpler because every single async had a bunch of wrapping of functions in it in the generated JavaScript. The reason we went with ES 2018 instead of 2017 like Lab was doing was because we released a version of poll that's an async iterator, and the async iterator is not recognized without ES 2018. And so JupyterLab now, I put in a PR to change it to ES 2018 as, no wait, did I do that yet? If I didn't, that's the next step, but it shouldn't really make a difference. I think 2017 to 2018 has minimal updates, but the bigger difference is the output code from Lumino is now basically ES Next, right? So if you were using it in an older browser, you're probably going to continue to use Lumino 1 for a while, or indefinitely rather. Lumino 1 is fine, right? It's been stable for quite some time, but in order to have a smaller footprint on what we output and be a bit more performant and to be able to read the code that's generated better, I think it really does make sense. Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Should we move on? Cool. Vidar.
Yeah, so I hate to be digging up the past since everybody's moving on to new and exciting things, but I just had some questions about the TreeX. So I was trying to run the JupyterLab benchmark thing against some of the TreeX branches, and it just failed, right? The question is, I don't remember what is the oldest version of JupyterLab where the benchmarking is supposed to work for? Because the background was that I recently tried to upgrade from 3.0x, I think it's 17 or 18, that is the latest one there, right? Onto the latest on the 3x branch, the 3.4.4 or whatever it is. And the performance for large notebooks, if you have a lot of large notebooks open, has dropped quite significantly, right? Which was a little bit surprising to me, given that I think most of the things that have touched it, there are things that are supposed to improve it, right? So that's why I wanted to see whether I just found a new corner case the benchmarks weren't covering, or whether all of the benchmark and performance improving stuff that I was thinking about actually happened in the 4x branch, and I'm just going to have to wait.
I think most performance has been in the 4x branch, but I don't know what the oldest version that benchmark support is. And the only person I know who knows is Fred, but maybe one of the 16 other people on this call knows. That sounds like a no. Yeah, so I guess, tag Fred in an issue and he'll probably be able to give a straight answer on that.
Yeah, so Mike, any data you have there on he left a comment talking about, he also saw some stuff. The more data you have, I could try to bisect it and figure out, so if this was a specific commit or like a version release, whether it's a Chrome release that has triggered this, anything to help kind of figure out the cause should be useful. But I have tested this with the same version of Chrome against 3.0x versus 3x latest, and the browser didn't affect that. But of course, there might be an additional issue from browser versions. But so yeah, if anybody has anything that can help me suggest which versions to look at to help bisect it, it would probably go quicker, because my notebooks for my environment where I am able to reproduce this isn't easy to change the version on the rebuild software. So
yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we have the information you need, but
I'll try to ping Fred and about the benchmark offline then.
and then you can be the second person who knows the answer to questions like that next time it comes up.
Problem with knowing the answer to question is people come and ask you questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. Cool. Okay. So last call for people adding stuff to the agenda. Otherwise, we'll move on to additional discussion, which I see has an item in it now, which is great. But yeah, is there anything you'd like to announce? Any PR you're working on you want to talk about? Isabella has her hand up.
Yep, just that the accessibility meeting will be 15 minutes after the scheduled end of this one. That's all. Thanks.
I think the word scheduled there implies we're going to end early, and I think that might be true. Okay, cool. So why don't we move on? Oh, actually, you know what? Now's a good time to do one final reminder. We picked the 15th, which is actually 8 days from today, as the deadline for making a nomination of someone who's in the JupyterLab Council to be our software steering council representative. So that means that if you think there's someone who's not currently on the JupyterLab Council, you can still get them on there in time to nominate them. Now, nothing stops you from making nominations 2 weeks from now. That's cool too. But nominations for the JupyterLab Council, right? But something does stop you for nominations to the SSE, which is we just won't have enough time to vote if we wait much longer. We could push it back maybe 1 week, but that's about it. So this is an exhortation. If there's someone you either want to nominate for the JupyterLab Council, or if there's a member of the JupyterLab Council you'd like to nominate to run for the SSE, for that latter, just double check with them and make sure they're willing to accept it before you nominate them. And yeah, Fred made a post about this in the mailing list, so please submit your nomination there. I think that's it. Is that everything everyone needs to know about this, Jason or Jason? Cool. All right. In that case, why don't we move on to the additional discussion section where Pete has a link to an IPython issue.
So this was a topic of discussion in the Jupyter widgets meeting. The topic, I need to do a proper write-up, but Jason keeps prodding me to get something going. It's basically how to do rich outputs, and this is basically JavaScript outputs that can do things like open COM channels in a portable way, so it works across multiple front ends and does not require extensions to be installed. I've been sort of like, championing this for a while from the Colab perspective, just a way to make rich outputs without extensions, but would really like a proposal that would work everywhere across JupyterLab, across any other like front ends. And just sort of, I don't know, I guess there's a little bit more interest in it. It's not quite clear what the forum should be for basically deciding what this is. I have an initial prototype that I did a couple years ago, actually, at this point, but I don't have the sort of ability to fully maintain like the JupyterLab extension. And in order to fully support it in like Colab, we would sort of want, we like to only expose APIs which are sort of fully stable, fully signed off. And so we'd sort of want, before we roll out like our implementation of this, would want broader sort of support from the community. To some degree, this is a little bit of overlap with like NB format, because this is trying to do a, I'd say a bit of a specification about how like these rich outputs should behave across all front ends. But it's also, I think this JupyterLab forum is a little bit, has the people that would be intended for it. I'm curious about thoughts or any other, did you have anything to add, Jason?
Sure. Yeah, the way I thought about it after you presented yesterday in the widgets meeting is what you're proposing is a new MIME type that is a JavaScript-based MIME type. But this MIME type, when it's rendered, has a guarantee of an API available to it for notebook operations or cell operations or being able to connect to the kernel, et cetera. So the way we sort of say we guarantee that the environment provides this particular API is we say for this particular MIME type, if you say your JavaScript code is this particular MIME type, then this API will be available. And then the question is, what should be in an API that's cross front end, so available in Colab, Databricks, JupyterLab, Jupyter Notebook, Colab. I already say Colab. Whatever else other front end is going to support this MIME type, and that's the question. What would a minimal would a minimal API available to the JavaScript in this particular MIME type look like in order to give some extra functionality? And this sort of recaptures some of the Wild West crazy but awesome exploration being able to do cool things without writing a lot of npm packages and things like this that we had in the classic notebook, where the Python code in the kernel could send JavaScript to the front end and do like really cool stuff with the notebook. This kind of captures some of that by providing an API that's a specific but generic API.
From the API design perspective, Colab has had sort of a stable API that's a very, very bare bones API. It doesn't require any like external libraries, anything like that, just to keep it very simple. And the goal is that it's versioned basically like the browser, in that you can check if an API is available, and that if it's available, it should just work. And the intention there is to really avoid versioning issues, that you can just use this API. If it's available, then you can use it.
And I think it connects to the larger scope of where you were saying there's a connection to NB format. We have not defined any MIME types really for MIME bundles in the notebook format. I think there's an implicit assumption that text plain is an available MIME type that is rendered as plain text in whatever the front end it is. But there's no other specification for other standardized MIME types that we encourage front ends to support. And so whether or not we want to go down that route of having an official list of MIME types that we have as officially supported things, or that we encourage front ends to implement or something like that, I guess that's a separate question. But I think your prototype is very interesting, because your prototype essentially makes a renderer for a specific MIME type, for a custom MIME type that has this API.
What is a streaming MIME type?
It allows you to, or will allow you to, request a specific part of say data frame, and you can paginate and load the data lazily.
So like it's a URL with some extra metadata saying, go to this URL, and there's some API the URL has, and here's the values for the parameters for the URL for the post request or something.
Or it could be.
Yes, that was discussed, I think, 4 years ago, before JupyterLab 1.0 release. And I recently bumped into that issue and thought that that would resolve quite a few of the problems that renderers have.
You could imagine the MIME type being associated with a set, like a protocol, where let's say this is the streaming REST MIME type, and that means it implements, all you need to know is an endpoint, but like all the queries are standardized, right? So it's like the pagination queries all follow a standard that matches that MIME type. And there might be like a WebSocket version as well for like a different kind of stream, but there might be basically both like conventional decisions made that are tied to the MIME type and completely agnostic about your implementation, and agnostic about like you don't have to give that much metadata. All you might be able to get away with simply providing a URL, and the rest is baked in because of how much we know, having specified the MIME type or something like that, I can imagine.
So in Colab's use, at least for this, and I think which is like fairly common, we see it for, I think some of the cases that it's come up is just Plotly, Bokeh, like Altair, being able to create interactive graphics. And really, because this is trying to be a long-term stable API, really trying to slim it down to the absolute like bare minimum of what needs to be done. For some things like streaming, you could argue that it could just be built on top of comms, and maybe comms is like the lowest primitive that we would support. And I think that's one of the challenges here, is coming up with the sort of like bare bones minimal API that can be sort of useful and that can be supported reliably broadly across all front ends is sort of a goal.
So just to comment on that last point, right? There was for comms, there didn't used to be that you could send you couldn't send buffers, I think, with com open. So that was something that was added. I think the spec was open for it, but there were certain packages that didn't implement support for it or something like this. I don't remember what it was, but so at some point there was changes to the API, right? So for that minimal API, you would be, of course, completely unable to make any changes like that.
Yeah, I mean, how to, I think the question is how to expose the feature so that you can detect whether or not the client supports it. And one of those may be like send with buffers, exposing a method there that you can check if the client actually supports that send with buffers, to try to add mechanisms to gracefully add those. The API needs to be able to support like adding additional functionality, but it needs to be sort of graceful and allow clients to know whether or not an API is supported. I mean, so semvered mime type, I think that the goal is really to avoid semantic versioning, and I think use a more like browser type API where this is as minimal as possible, and that, you know, old content against like, you know, there shouldn't be version 1.0, version 2.0, breaking changes, etc. I think we can just support like a minimal API with graceful additions. You know, I've linked elsewhere to the API that Colab uses. That's something that we've had stable for a very long period of time, and we've been very sort of careful about what we add there. And I think that model can work for multiple front ends.
There is a named Jupyter subproject called Jupyter Standards. It is not a subproject that actively meets right now. I think this is the perfect sort of thing for that group to be doing, because it doesn't seem like it shoehorns into MB format, but it does seem like in order to give people the reassurance that they should spend time implementing support for this, it really does need to be published somewhere with some assurances that this is slow moving, that this is going to be long lasting, and not just a clever thing that we shipped with JupyterLab. So I think one thing that I will do as a follow-on to this call is send a message to the people that I know who volunteered to be on that subproject and say, hey, I want to do some work. And by next week, maybe we can arrange follow-on conversations and figure out how to not wait 4 more years. Jason Grau, I believe you are one of the people in that subproject.
Yes, I am. It's kind of interesting, though, that in Jupyter, a lot of times the standards follow the implementation. Sometimes the standards precede the implementation, but are informed by prototypes. And so in this case, if you're trying to establish an API that is cross-platform, cross-front end, you know, IPython would be a good place for it, as in that's the kernel backend. Maybe that would have at least an initial implementation. JupyterLab would be a good place for it to rough out an idea, maybe inspired by the existing API that's in Colab. But both of those, I think, would inform a standard discussion. So while I think standards could take it up, I think being really informed by work It doesn't do any good to publish a standard if no one's going to implement it. I think the web has shown us that that's a pathway to nowhere. So, so if I was on the standards, putting my standards committee hat on, I would say, where's the implementation? And you know, is JupyterLab / Jupyter Notebook committing to maintain it? Like, do they want to support this as a standard?
So maybe, I think first off, we're kind of in a state of flux and a mad rush to release 4.0. So I wouldn't propose opening a PR, but maybe if there are people who right now plan to follow up and work on this, we could see if everyone's okay with creating a JupyterLab org repo for an extension that does this, so that it's happening under JupyterLab, but you know, it's not contingent on what's happening with the JupyterLab 4 release. Do we have people who are currently able to commit time to build a JupyterLab 4.x compatible Mime render Mime extension that plays with these ideas and basically modernizes Pete's implementation, I imagine, right?
And that is a $64 question. So maybe at this point we could say, people think about it, you know, and if it sounds like something interesting to you, then let us know next week. Another thing we can do is create an issue in the JupyterLab repo. There is a tag for extension idea. Every now and then we get a new person that comes by and says, oh, this is a great extension idea, and you know, runs with it. So that would be another avenue for finding people to work on this.
If you work on a team that does Jupyter things and you're looking for a thing to do, this might be a high impact one. So, you know, go back and talk to your team and see if they are on board for maybe funding you to work on this, because it does seem pretty cool. It does seem like if we don't, there will be lots of ad hoc attempts to achieve what this wants to achieve anyway, because people want to type something in the notebook cell and get something in the output that's cool, and they'll figure out ways of doing it that are dirtier or cleaner. So giving them better tools will probably be less pain in the long run.
And honestly, this is helping people migrate from the classic notebook where all these APIs were available, you know, to code that was running from the kernel. So like there's real world use cases that people have come to us and asked, like, how do I talk to a kernel from an output? Things like this.
Yeah,
I
maybe some of the people on the Notebook 7 effort would see value in this in terms of porting existing extensions. Like, actually, if we were able to, or at least would contribute to what kind of APIs could be useful to have, right? If we have this, and this, I should be able to port most of these extensions over, right?
So I think the idea is out there now. I think a good next step would be posting an issue on the JupyterLab repo that condenses this conversation down, and people can add like why they think it's valuable, and then we have the start of an idea that's consolidated from several different sources here.
Would it be better to do this off the JupyterLab repo, in case somebody doesn't feel like it's a neutral ground?
Well, there's two things here. So having it in the JupyterLab org might free up some people to work on it. But yeah, it also is then like the JupyterLab implementation. I think just on balance, it's probably going to allow more people to work on it if it's within a Jupyter org than outside.
Right, but what about the Jupyter org compared to the JupyterLab org? Is this a
I don't think, no, I don't believe it is. This is more like when we vote to bring an extension in, except it's voting to work on an extension But until people volunteer to do that work, there's no point, right, in creating a blank repo. But I think this is, as Jason said, an extension idea, really. And so that doesn't strike me as JEP yet, but I think what might be the JEP is if the implementation is good, everyone's on board, and we want to say, cool, this is the standard that Jupyter is offering the world. That might be a JEP. I don't know. Okay.
Maybe one other piece of feedback I would love to solicit. William, you represent another front end for Jupyter. If we had an API, if we had a MIME type that proposed that there would be an API available to the JavaScript code in this particular MIME type that would allow interaction with the kernel, or getting the DOM element for the output, or some of these basic API minimal API that Pete has mentioned. Would you be interested in implementing it for your front end?
Definitely would. And it would be nice to not have to reverse engineer what it is, and to actually just be able to read a description and implement it would be a dream, because I mean, clearly it's been well tested and used a lot by Colab, so it would be really valuable. Yeah, it's much better than having to take random notebooks, look at what JavaScript they think should be there, and try to guess at what you need to reverse engineer, which is surely what P probably did some of in coming up with this API. It also helps clarify what you want to be available from the kernel. And I also, when you were mentioning all the MIME types, it would be nice to say more about what, how they're supposed to be rendered and what they actually are. Because I think kernel authors, to some extent, kind of, there may be mutually incompatible interpretations of MIME types, and then that makes it difficult for front ends, because you have to say, oh, if it's the, Julia kernel, interpret things one way, and if it's the R kernel, interpret them differently, which is not the way it should be. So I mean, that's a different discussion, but it's kind of related. So yeah, huge +1 to Pete's proposal from my point of view.
Cool. Any other questions, comments? I'm going to stop the recording in case there's anything you'd like to say off the record. Brace yourselves.